you can. Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to be joining you from the UK. So it's quite late here. It's just 10 p.m., but I know it's bright and early for all of you over in New Zealand. So I'm sure you've got your tea and coffee. I'm thrilled to be part of this really important event, even from afar, and I look forward to sharing the kind of insights that we've got of the stuff that's going on in Scotland, but also learning from the discussions that we'll have afterwards today. So my name's Sarah Lewis. I am Research, Policy and Education Director at the UK Passivhaus Trust. Let's see if the slides are going to advance. Yes, excellent. So the Passivhaus Trust is an independent non-profit organisation that provides leadership in the UK for the adoption of the kind of Passivhaus standard and also the methodology. Our aim is very much to promote the principles of Passivhaus as a highly effective way of reducing energy use, but also carbon emissions from our buildings in the UK, as well as kind of providing those really high standards of comfort and building health that we all associate with Passivhaus. And then an important thing, even in the UK, and increasingly important in our warming climate, is this element around summer comfort that Passivhaus also does so well. So I'm sure everybody at the conference probably already knows this, but it's just always good to kind of reiterate. The Passivhaus standard really does remain the world's kind of leading international low energy building standard. And as a building concept, it can be adopted by anyone and used anywhere in the world. So it's very much not a brand, which I think sometimes there's a misconception there. And that's been really key to the Scottish government looking at that as a way forward. Initially, they were looking at it as a way forward for our new homes in Scotland, but now they're actually looking at it for all building typologies. So I popped this slide in following my attendance at the International Passivhaus Conference earlier this year. And I know the slide's a little tricky to see because it was a shot from my phone, but these were the global sea surface temperatures, and you can probably just about make out that line at yellow, which is like quite towards the top of the graph there, and that's the 2023 line. And the red line, which is significantly higher again, was the 2024 line at that point when that conference was in April. And the IPCC chair who was there presenting pointed out that it wasn't just the global sea surface temperatures. You got similar anomalies across all the kind of main metrics, so extent of sea ice, the area of wildfires in Canada, and just various things. And all of these were anomalies to the point that they were almost having to readjust the scale to be able to show 2024 on a graph. So it's just kind of like bringing that back in to remember why it's so important that nations start to take these kind of steps, these policy steps towards getting better performing buildings. And then, of course, Passivhaus is therefore being turned to by designers around the world as we're kind of looking for a standard for our buildings of the future. And it was really encouraging to be able to have conversations with the Scottish government and our Scottish building control team and kind of take forward recommendations that we're able to have from workshops that we've held with people like RIAS, which is Royal Institute of Architects for Scotland, on how the architectural body in the UK feel that Passivhaus metrics and methodologies could benefit the way that we build our buildings. And of course, the best time to start all of this was 20 years ago, but the second best time to start all of this is right now, which is why these conversations are so important. So Passivhaus, and again, I'm sure everybody at the conference already knows all of this, but it's backed by 30 years of evidence, and it really does provide us with a range of proven approaches to deliver the new and existing buildings that we need to be optimized for that kind of net zero future. And we feel really strongly that it is no time to reinvent the wheel. The tools we need to deliver on all of our climate pledges when it comes to our buildings exist today. So we've just got to get to work. The Passivhaus standard does provide us with the best solutions that we know of to certainly get us across the hurdles that we're coming across in the UK to achieving net zero. And of course, Passivhaus is no longer seen as a niche standard. In the UK, we've got over 7,000 units currently, or I think it's maybe even 8,000 now, units currently under development around the country. And these images up on the screen were just to give a flavour of some of the completed projects and those currently underway, including this vast range of typologies from business centres and universities to swimming pools. And I popped the hospital in there as well. It's not a UK project, but another really interesting typology. So hopefully it's clear from this slide that the Passivhaus standard is not prescriptive in terms of design or materials, which again can be a misconception. It's just a guarantee of building performance. And of course, it does encourage good design from an energy perspective. But if you wanted to insist on a poor form factor, you can still get that working. You're just going to have to compensate for those decisions elsewhere in the building. So overall, the building still performs. So this is kind of, I'm moving on to kind of like this, how Scotland is getting on, which is the kind of focus of the presentation today. So it's currently estimated that there are about 35 Passivhaus schools currently underway or in the pipeline in Scotland, which is very remarkable since the first Scottish Passivhaus school was only completed last year. So we've gone from 0 to potentially 35 in a really short amount of time. So the thing which instigated this change was the Scottish Futures Trust, which is a funding mechanism for schools in Scotland. And basically what they did is they linked performance in use through data from meter readings to release of funding over a 25-year period. So to de-risk projects, clients and contractors were looking to see what they could do. And of course, very quickly, they arrived at Passivhaus for all the reasons that I'm sure you're all very familiar with. I'm not here to specifically talk about the Scottish Schools Programme, but it is a key part of the kind of story, the Scottish Passivhaus story anyway. So I do encourage you to look on the Passivhaus Trust website, where we've got loads of information about that schools programme. One really important outcome from that schools programme has been the Scottish construction industry, and in particular, those really large contractors that we refer to as tier 1 contractors have really just embraced the challenge of the Passivhaus standard, and so have their supply chains. So I think often something which is kind of put forward for a reason for not going for Passivhaus, even in say like small domestic developments, would be like the contractors in the supply chain couldn't support it. But we're seeing these multi-million-pound schools coming forward and being delivered to the standard. So it does show that when the ambition is there, the contractors in the supply chain really are happy to step up to that challenge. And then social housing providers and local authorities have been undertaking Passivhaus projects for a number of years in Scotland. The last couple of years, there's been a dramatic increase in the kind of scale of planned social housing projects with sites of 2, 3, 4, 400 plus homes, which is all really pretty exciting. And of course, I can't not put up a selection of self-build projects just to make sure that whenever we're talking about Passivhaus in any sector, I think it's important for people to see the diversity of styles and typologies being delivered to meet the same performance standards. So people understand it's not prescriptive in terms of design. It's just giving us a framework to deliver good buildings. And then if that wasn't enough inspiration, here's a bunch of other Scottish projects, the 70 plus projects, which we made up into a kind of wallpaper for our UK Passivhaus conference last year, because it was based up in Scotland. And you can see a full range of those projects again on the UK Passivhaus Trust website if you are interested. So in terms of what we're aiming for in Scotland, we're really talking about Passivhaus Classic, because at the moment we're talking about energy efficiency in the buildings. Now, there could be a renewables target, and if there was, that might be more like Passivhaus Classic plus some renewables. It could go as far as, Passivhaus Plus. I will get on to the exact standard that Scotland is looking at, but from the Passivhaus Trust perspective, when we're talking about it, we tend to be talking about Passivhaus Classic when we're talking about metrics and targets. And then this is just to give our kind of international audience today an idea of the kind of step change that we're talking about in the UK from our kind of business as usual approach. So this chart shows all the energy losses on the left through the building fabric, so the walls and the roof and the windows, etc. And then all the gains on the right that a typical house built in Scotland or in England last year or this year would typically consume. well, this was before the new regulation. We just had a new set of regulations. So this is a kind of slightly historic. So it's your solar gains on the right, your internal gains, and then you can see the huge amount that's required for that space heating demand. And that's you've got your performance gap there as well. So we have had new regulations come in, and that has brought it down that little bit that's shown on the screen right now. But we know in terms of the space heating demand, that area in pink, it's still pretty significant. And we still have this performance gap that we've not yet been able to eradicate through our new standards. Of course, very new standards, it's difficult to say because we're still waiting for performance and use, but we haven't seen any meaningful change to the way those buildings are being procured or constructed. So I would expect the performance gap at the moment to still be on that graph. So if we just compare this slide now with a passive house building, this is the fundamental principle of passive house. It's to reduce those heat losses so significantly that the building's heating demand can largely be met by the sun, by the people, and those internal gains. So on the right, and then you've just got this small space heating demand. And it's important when we're thinking about metrics that we want to be going forward with our building regulations that they meet other standards as well. So the REBA 2030 Climate Challenge and LETI, which I don't know how well known LETI is in New Zealand. Can I have a show of hands if do people know about LETI? Oh, lots of people do. That's good. So it's the Lower Energy Transformation Initiative, and it's a really good organization, and they have a climate emergency design guide, which is really worth a read. And both of those standards set a kind of space heating target of around that 15 kilowatt hours per meter squared per annum. So there's this kind of cross-industry recognition that passive house level of performance is roughly what we all need to do to get to that kind of net zero future. And then this is a quote, a well-known quote by Wolfgang Faust, the founder of the kind of passive house standard. He was working as a physicist, had read the construction industry, had experimented with adding insulation to new buildings, and the energy consumption had failed to reduce. So effectively, that's exactly what we see. Our building regulations are incrementally getting better, but we're still got this big performance gap. We're not seeing the performance out the other end that we should. So it offended him as a physicist. It was counter to the basic laws of physics. He knew he must be doing something wrong and made it his mission to find out what that was and establish what was needed to do it right. And that was the passive house standard. So every time we're having discussions with politicians or policymakers, we're trying to really press the point that there's no point in just incrementally making the regulations closer and closer to passive house if we're not dealing with the performance gap, which is much more to do with a holistic approach to design. We're talking about, quality coming through from the initial modeling on a project using PHPP, all the way through designs, making sure our designs actually work, through to getting those construction details right, constructing it right on site, and that commissioning stage. So there's a kind of all that stuff that Passive House has worked out. We need to get into our building regulations if we do want to realize all of these performance improvements as well. And of course, if our buildings don't perform, we're all going to be paying the cost of that. So this graph, I'll just describe the graph very quickly. So you've got internal temperatures up on, can you see my mouse? Can people see my mouse when I'm moving it around?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, cool. So this is the internal temperature up here on this side of the graph. This is just the course of one day. So this is like a 24-hour period. And then you can see the heating power up on the right-hand side of the graph. So this dark sort of mauve line is showing the internal temperatures in the house being, 22 degrees, comfortable temperature. The heating turns off, there's no power injection, and the temperature drops down to, 14, under 15 degrees. It's the morning, so people pump the heating on. Everyone does it exactly the same time. There's a big surge on the national grid. We all get some heat. The houses warm up. Everybody pops off to work and school. Heating turns off, and then the temperature comes back down inside those buildings. And this is like a typical new build house that was modeled. So this is not like historic stock. This is what we're building right now, and this does not support in a helpful way a move to an all-electric grid, because when you move to an all-electric grid, you really have an issue with this peak demand. So the grid can't support the kind of peak demand of all our homes and all our buildings moving onto electricity from the gas heating that we have in the UK at the moment. So that's a real problem for us. A passive house, by contrast, this is its model. So you have this consistent temperature, which is sitting at that kind of just around 20 degrees. And then you can see that the power injection, instead of being up at sort of 15 kilowatts, now we're just talking about 3 kilowatts. And actually, we can pop that energy into those houses at any time during the day that suits the grid. So there's no extra strain on that peak load, which is the thing which is going to cost us a huge amount of money to upgrade the infrastructure. And some people, clever people than me, have done some calculations on this. And Passivhaus could save the UK over £20 billion in energy infrastructure investment over the next 20 years. And that was just if we were to say that all our homes were going to be Passivhaus from this time forward, rather than our current building regulations. So when people are like, oh, it costs a bit more to build these buildings, sometimes you're like, well, it also costs a lot more to not build these buildings. So there's definite things at a national level that when we're having those policy discussions should be discussed and should be calculated. And then this is just the quick step back on why we're doing all this, why all this stuff's important in the first place. This was the IPCC special report from 2018 that was identifying the CO2 pathway that we're going to need to follow to get to net zero. So you can see the sort of green line of where the trajectory we were going, and this red line was like what we had to do. And of course, this line just gets steeper and steeper and steeper every day we don't make meaningful steps towards reducing our carbon emissions. So we absolutely have to act now. And it's why the Scottish Passivhaus equivalent sort of standard that we're here to talk about today is so exciting. And just to be clear, for our sector, our building sector, to meet its part of this reduction, we're not talking about those like gentle, slow, incremental improvements in our building performance targets that we've historically had. We've got to be very real and agree that this needs urgent and dramatic action. And it needs to happen not in 2045, but today, or as close as possible to today. So if we can get as many people doing it today as possible, that's excellent. And then the policy change really needs to come in as swiftly as possible. So with this really steep line in mind, we can just look and see how the UK is getting on with that trajectory. So this was greenhouse gas emissions from our buildings over a decade there. And you can see that there was no discernible improvement. So we're not doing our bit at the moment. We've got a lot more to do. Okay, so how are we going to change all of this? What's the positive story here? So firstly, we had a citizens' assembly in June, well, it was 2022 into 2021, and I'll explain what that was in a minute. Then the Citizens' Assembly led to an MSP, so a member of Scottish Parliament, putting together a private members bill, which happened in August 2021. In December 2022, it was debated in Parliament, and the Scottish Government confirmed that they would make subordinate legislation to implement that bill by the end of 2024. So we're now in this period of sort of helping support the development of what the Scottish Passivhaus equivalent standard could be. When I put this slide together initially, which would have been at the start of this year, I guess, that was the end of the timeline. It's since sort of expanded slightly, and that's because of the current consultation. So I've got a new slide which didn't used to be here, which is saying that there's a consultation which is out at the moment, which came out on the 31st of July. It closes on the 23rd of August. And what the Scottish Government is currently doing is consulting on general principles of what the standard should be. The next date will be summer next year, which will still allow them to lay. So basically, what they committed to doing was laying legislation that was needed to support the Scottish Passivhaus equivalent coming in. So any legislative changes that they need to make in the standards are being consulted on at the moment. And then the idea is that they will pass that legislation by, I think it's about the 14th of December this year. So it's quite tight to that point. That will allow them to have met that obligation. And then next summer, they're going to consult on the detailed metrics and targets, which will make up the new standards. In the current consultation, they've put forward these two dates, which we think are really sensible. So I've included them in my timeline, which is that a voluntary standard should come in initially, and that should come in for 2026. And then that should just become mandatory by 2028. What we're really conscious of is we want the standard to be deliverable. I think the worst case would be you bring in a standard and people are not able to deliver it the supply chains aren't able to meet the demand, or there's not the skills, whatever the issues might be. By bringing it in as a voluntary standard initially, we will be able to iron out any issues. And then by 2028, the industry will have the confidence to be able to deliver to the new standard. So that is light blue on this slide because it's not confirmed those dates, but that is what the top piece of consultation, so this general principles consultation, the final question in that said, should we bring it in as a voluntary standard in 2026, mandatory for 2028, which is something that we've promoted and supported throughout the development of the consultation. So we were pleased to see that because it feels really sensible. But now I'm just going to whiz through what those other various steps were. So on the previous slide, this stuff, so the Citizens Assembly and the Private Members Bill. So the Citizens Assembly, this is really great. I don't know, can you guys give me hands up? Does New Zealand have citizens assemblies? Is this something you guys are familiar with? No hands. Okay, I'm going to say no then. So a citizens assembly is just a group of people, general citizens, that are brought together to learn about a topic that affects the country, discuss that topic, and reach conclusions. Scotland's Climate Assembly was held from 2020 to 2021, and it was looking specifically at how Scotland should tackle the climate crisis in a fair and effective way. And 97% voted in favour of Passivhaus or Passivhaus equivalent for new build projects in Scotland. So that assembly of people is made up of, there might be some architects and engineers in there, but it's also made up of grandmothers and parents and teachers and just a whole range. The idea is you get a full cross-section of society. So what that citizens assembly comes up with in Scotland has to be discussed by the Scottish government on any topic when an assembly is put together and goes through this process. So that was really great. It gave a real mandate to the idea of having Passivhaus brought in as a building standard. And in response to this report, the Scottish government had stated that the assembly has had this climate assembly has had a profound impact within government, giving government a mandate to act in some of the most challenging areas and opening the door for new conversations now taking place across government. So I can't understate enough how much of an impact that kind of grassroots citizen-based work has had in us moving forward. Because then Alec Rowley, one of our MSPs, put forward this private members bill. So Scottish Parliament has 129 elected members, our MSPs. They represent their constituents on devolved matters, and that includes our building standards. So it's one of the areas that that we have control in Scotland over. So the Scottish building standards is different than the English building standards. And one of the actions an MSP can take is to introduce a bill to change a law. So Alec Rowley's party was not in power at the time, and they are not in power in Scotland at this moment. He's a Labour MSP, and that is the party that's recently come in at Westminster. So there has been a big change, but in Scotland, our next election round is 2026. But anyway, so Alec put forward this bill, and he said that building a Passivhaus is the epitome of a spend to save approach. By investing now, we save both financially and environmentally over the term of the project. And I think he's talking probably specifically around fuel poverty and benefits to our National Health Service by having people in warmer, healthier homes. But there's also that thing about the national grid and the infrastructure investment savings that we would have if we adopted this throughout the country. So this was just I don't know, this is interesting. I thought this was quite interesting when I was learning all of this for the first time as we were going through this. So this is just what happened with the private members bill. So basically, the MSP writes the bill. It went to public consultation in May 2022. The consultation closed in July. There was this period for them to do an analysis of the responses, which started in July. The final proposal was then lodged to Parliament in November, and it received cross-party support. I think it was the next day or the day afterwards. So really quickly afterwards, a number of people across the various parties supported the bill. And over 90% of the responses that they got to the bill, which they said was also an unprecedented number of responses for a bill of this nature, they had 90% overall supportive responses, which was really great as well. And then this was the exciting bit. So this was my bedtime story reading with my two girls, who at the time were 4 and 6 years old. And during the 18-minute parliamentary discussions, we had Passivhaus said 19 times. So, and it received this cross-party support, which was really amazing. And I don't know, that might be an international first to have it discussed that much in Parliament. But I think for us, the important thing was that it was cross-party. There wasn't one party that was against it. It was like everyone was like, oh yes, this seems sensible. So everybody supported it. So it was much more of a discussion than a debate. But then in putting these slides together, I realized that those two girls who were 4 and 6 are now rapidly approaching 7 and 9. So it might feel like we're doing this really fast, but in many ways, we need to be moving much faster than we are. And then following that successful discussion in Parliament on the 10th of January, 2023, they announced that they would make subordinate legislation within 2 years, which brings us to this December, to introduce a new minimum environmental design standard for all new build housing to meet a Scottish equivalent to the Passivhaus standard. And that has since been broadened by the Scottish Building Standards Department or Division to include all new buildings. So we are looking at more than just housing now. So the main work that we were doing at the Passivhaus Trust has really been trying to help with the development and support for the standard through upskilling in the industry, working with industry working groups, working with the Scottish Building Standards team, and working as much as we can with events and awareness raising. So one of the things we did was developed with Coaction, the UK-based Passivhaus training company, free Passivhaus course, and we got that co-developed with RIBA, which is the Royal Institute of British Architects, so that it is now available in all 65 architecture schools around the UK, free for every single student who's on an undergraduate or postgraduate course. So it includes an introduction to design performance. It includes a module on climate responsible architecture, climate responsible construction, and climate responsible services. So it covers all those elements of Passivhaus. You might notice that we've not called it Passivhaus because we don't want people to not teach it if they don't personally believe that Passivhaus, they might have misconceptions about it. So we've called it design performance for climate action, because everyone can get behind that. And Passivhaus is just a really good way to deliver it. And then we've created this kind of crib note for tutors to be able to take in when they're working with students in the studio space. Because what we don't want this to be is some academic thing which sits on the side of what the students are doing in their studio practice. We want the tutors to be asking those questions around building performance throughout those crits and tutorials that the students are having. And of course, there's loads of work in upskilling contractors and site-based personnel as well. So we've got a really great innovation centre in Scotland called BEST, which is Built Environment Smarter Transformation. And Coaction have worked with them to develop some really good practical Passivhaus in practice kind of courses. So those are really great. And I think they've trained up something like 2,500 people through the courses at BEST so far. And of course, Passivhaus is already known as a kind of quality standard, and a large part of that does come down to the training that is provided and those international qualifications that you can get. So we've got like certified designers and consultants, we've got certified tradespeople. The Passivhaus Trust in the UK, we also have like an endorsement process. When we'll endorse courses that other people are delivering, if they cover Passivhaus topics. And we've got different levels for that as well, just so we can promote as much training as possible, because there's lots and lots of people who do need to get trained. And then whenever we are talking about Passivhaus, when we're not surrounded by all the people who are kind of well versed in Passivhaus and already understand how well it performs and all the things, you have to deal with all the misconceptions, of course. So the first one to clear up is, of course, to clarify that the house in Passivhaus is German for building rather than specifically looking at the typology for houses. So often in the UK, people think Passivhaus is just for homes. And then the most important message that we try to communicate is that Passivhaus is at its heart a comfort and health standard, and it creates buildings with optimal environmental conditions for the people, for the occupants inside those buildings. We also think it provides the best route to minimize whole life carbon. And as a methodology, it sort of encourages the optimization of embodied carbon. It is, of course, this international leading energy standard that it's probably most well known for. But along with this, it's also this proven quality assurance, and it gives us performance and without a performance gap. And that makes it the most appropriate standard for us to look at for our buildings, which currently do suffer from that performance gap. But then the other big thing is that designing to Passivhaus principles is just not the same as designing and building to the Passivhaus standard. Now, in Scotland, we are looking at Passivhaus equivalency. So for us, the key is that it's not just some new metrics woven into a business as usual approach. We want to see a new approach to building standards compliance. And that is what we're consulting on effectively at the moment. Okay, so then what are these just kind of general key principles and characteristics of Passivhaus that are going to have to be included in any new standard if we do want to deliver on these government ambitions? So of course, we need something that's able to look at the principles of form factor, which is the kind of shape and complexity, but also the orientation of our buildings, because these things are often set very early on in a project. And at the moment, we use like a notional building model, which I think you guys might use too. And it just does not encourage the optimization of either of those two things, because you just put your notional building in with whatever has been designed and you do an improvement on that. So we need something that actually brings this into the discussion. And then, of course, the next 5 principles I'm going to talk about are just basic physical characteristics that relate to building fabric. And these are pretty much universal around any building in the UK is going to have very good continuity of insulation. It's going to have triple glazed windows. It's going to have very good mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. It's going to be very airtight. And it's going to be free of thermal bridges, or at least thermal bridging will have been quantified and minimized. So then the thing is it as easy as just saying, do these things on the slide and we'll have ourselves Passivhaus performance? Well, any Passivhaus designer probably knows the answer is not quite. So all Passivhaus buildings might have those physical characteristics principles in common, but they also need to have the principle of quality assurance. They need to have accurate modeling in PHVP. We need to have good site testing using our blower door tests, and we need to make sure we're doing the right commissioning at the end of that project before we hand it over. We have a Claiming the Passivhaus standard document, which I think you guys have a version of as well, which is a really good reference document when people are claiming Passivhaus. It's really easy for people to say, oh, my building is pretty much a Passivhaus. I followed the principles. I can say it's a Passivhaus when it's just not. And it's these bits on this slide that I think are the bits that people often don't think of as a core principle of Passivhaus, but in a way, this is the most important stuff. It's getting the modeling right, making those right design choices, and following that quality assurance all the way through the project from that design through to completion. Okay, I realize that I'm probably running a little tight on time. I'll run through the rest of these slides quite quick, but I just think it's quite useful to kind of give you the rest of the narrative that we're kind of trying to discuss whenever we're meeting with politicians or other people in the industry. So this is one of the things which, like, over time as an industry, we've started to utilize more and more complex modeling techniques. So we can have half-hourly or even 10-minute increments on how energy moves through our buildings. But interestingly, as this complexity is increased and increased, the accuracy of those results is not got any better. We're not getting more reliable predictions in terms of the performance gap. And in fact, we still on the whole are producing buildings that don't work. Passivhaus is very powerful, partly because of its simplicity, and it just uses this very simple monthly or annual energy balance. And that is more than sufficient. So further resolution than that probably is better to do once the building is operating and you can optimize it that way. So I'll just say a couple of things about PHVP. So of course, both a simple energy model, like an energy balance tool like PHVP, and dynamic modeling are great, and they can both produce really good results. So I'm not saying that dynamic modeling doesn't have a place, because it absolutely does. It's just not necessary for all building types. So where we know a lot about how the building typology performs already, it's most likely that PHEP will be sufficient. The energy balance tool will already have been verified for that typology, so we can go straight to it and we're going to know it works. The good thing about PHEP is because of it being a simple energy balance tool, it gives instantaneous results. There's no waiting around. Data entry has been reduced to essential values, so you have less modeling time. And it actually allows designers to test options in PHEP without spending loads of time with modeling or even drawing out solutions. So while that energy balancing tool tells us our kind of monthly predictions on how much energy the building is going to have, if we did want to see something in more granularity, which might be something to do with like overheating, then we might want to use a dynamic model for that. It's just not necessary for everything. So PHP is a really good tool, and it's a good design tool to have in the design space as an architect. So I found certainly when I was working as an architect, when I used PHP, it's like mind opening. It's like, oh, look, suddenly I can actually tell the client why I'm making the decisions I'm making, and I can get instantaneous information on the exact performance change it makes to the building as well. So it's a really good tool. It's that tool for everyday design work. It's just a spreadsheet at the end of the day. It produces really simple building energy calculations for quick results. And it's a transparent way to record assumptions that you've used in your energy modeling. It's pretty easy for quality checking. PHPP, oh, it's Easy PHPP or Easy PH, they're calling it, was obviously launched earlier this year, and they came out with a new version of that, I think, just the other week. So yeah, so PHP, a great piece of software for designers to use. And one of the things is that it allows us to look at the impact of decisions we're making around that space heating and cooling demand. So that's the metric that you often refer to in Passivhaus. And it's because that is the metric that the architecture affects. So the form factor, the air tightness, the insulation, the orientation, how your windows are sitting in that, and of course your ventilation system. All of those things are contributing to that number, that metric, your space heating demand or heating load, and your cooling demand. And of course, then there's the wider energy uses in the building to do with sort of unregulated emissions around sort of plug loads and your hot water use and lighting. And that in the UK, we refer to that as energy use intensity. That's our most common sort of metric. And then, of course, in Passivhaus, we do also have the primary energy or primary energy renewable target. The blue line is really the kind of boundary that we're looking at in the UK. So these are the kind of numbers that we're most concerned about trying to get in, but this will now be for the next layer of consultation next summer. But for this consultation right now, we need to make sure that the right metrics get in there, because what we want to see is a change from a notional building. And the notional building has been in use since the beginning of energy modeling and basically of any energy reporting in our building standards. So it would be a huge change if we managed to get this. But what we want to have is a space heating demand or heat load target. And we would like to see both of the options in there, just like Passivhaus, because it gives that flexibility to designers, especially developers who might be wanting one building that they can rotate. We want to have a more tight air tightness target in there. We also want to have limits on summer overheating, surface temperatures, and ventilation. I'm not highlighting the primary energy and the primary and the energy generation, just because we're looking more at the EUI target, so one level down, which is basically the number that you see on your meter reading in your building, because we feel like that's the most powerful, because you're really empowering the occupants then to call out if their building's not performing. So you really do want the meter reading and the energy performance certificate to match so that people know what their buildings are meant to consume. And this is just to show you how our current modeling tools aren't working in the UK. So we modeled different house types, different standards that different England and Scotland were looking at in PHP and in SAP, which was our current energy modeling tool, and in this new one, the home energy model, which is currently under development and is the one that's going to be coming in next. So just for the purposes that if you just look at section 6, that's the current Scottish standard. So we can see that the difference from PHP to what our current tool, SAP, shows us is about 45%. So this is just space heat demand, but this is what this is saying is that SAP is underestimating space heat demand by 45%. So there's almost like a 45% performance gap before you even put a brick on the ground. really put a spade in the ground. But when you get to passive house level of performance, the performance gap is almost 500% for the space heating demand. And that's just at design stage. So before you even start to construct out these buildings. So there's a fundamental problem if the tool does not reflect reality. And unfortunately, the new HEM tool, we had to look at the beta test version of that. We've not seen the next iteration, but it was coming out with almost the exact same results. So that's a real problem for us because we weren't seeing discernible improvement there. And then a couple of other very quick bits. So the Scottish Building Standards team want to know how it's going to fit in with their regulations and the way that they administer the regulations. So this is from, I put a QR code up there just in case you wanted to see it, but this is from the REBA Passive House Overlay. It's a really excellent document that we collaborated with REBA to produce. Mark Siddle from the UK was the author on this. Anyway, it goes through all the different people in the design team or the project team that are involved in a passive house, sort of passive house designers, design teams, certifiers, building control, and it's got the REBA design stages along the bottom. So we were just showing when the built Scottish building warrant phases, what kind of check you could have in the passive house process at that point, and same with the completion. So it's just to show that it's easy to kind of put that all together. Maybe I'll just do like 3 more slides and then I'll kind of wrap up and we can have a chat. And if anything else is still relevant that I was going to show, I can always pull it up. So we've been working with these working groups to kind of look about how the standard is going to be implemented, and upskilling contractors and building supply chains is definitely something which has come up, particularly around MVHR, so qualifications, training, supply chain, all that kind of development. We don't have MVHR in our houses at the moment on the whole, so that is a big change for us in the UK. And then also professional capacity, we have to upskill the certifiers and verifiers, because we're not doing this through passive house certifiers, we're doing this through our building regulations. So there's quite a lot of people that need to be upskilled there. And of course, there's consultants as well, like architects, engineers, modelers. But we've been trying as much as possible to collaborate across the industry. So we've been working with Homes for Scotland, which is the house builders, sort of developers organization. And that's been very positive. We're hoping we'll get some good outcomes from that group. And there's various training programs which are being developed. I think this slide's really important just to say that, you know, a true Scottish passive house equivalent should deal with grid capacity. It should deal with seasonal disparity of when we generate energy. It should deal with health and well-being, fuel poverty, and it has to address the performance gap. And business as usual hasn't had to address those things, so it won't cut it. These are new concerns that we've got around the climate, and we need a new proven approach to deliver on that. These are our non-negotiables for the current consultation, which is we need the right tools, and we're pushing for PHEP or a better SAP or HEM. Effective metrics, so we're talking about absolute targets now, none of this notional building relative stuff. We want quality assurance built in, and we want a realistic timeline and training program. And we do want passive house is deemed to satisfy. So all certified projects will be deemed to satisfy. That's what we want to see. And that is in the consultation. Effective action. Oh, yeah, if you wanted to act on the Scottish Passive House equivalent, respond to the consultation. We need personalised and original responses. It can take only 10 minutes if you want. You can spend a couple of hours on it. Encourage others. We kind of need as many people as possible to respond to this. I included just this slide to show you how the consultation was laid out. I've got a QR code if you want to see the consultation. It might not be relevant to you to read and comment, although you'd be very welcome to on this consultation, but maybe it would give you ideas for things that you could put forward for consultations in your districts as well. So that's how the consultation is basically split out. It's got the overall proposals, then it goes into design, then compliance, then they've got a kind of call for current standards, and then this is a delivery program. Those were questions. We've got a little on the QR code, which is in a couple of slides. I go through each of the bits of the consultation which we think are important, and there's a little video on our website if that is of interest. The most positive things about this first stage of the consultation is it's really good, clear, technical information that's in the consultation. So that's why I'm sort of recommending you have a look at it, because it does show that the Scottish Building Standards team do understand why Passive House works. It does reflect and distill the opinions of the cross-industry working groups. It proposes this transition period, which we like, and it does contain all the elements which, if supported and adopted, could lead to that paradigm shift that we're talking about in Scottish building standards and this ultimate adoption of a Scottish Passive House equivalent standard. However, it's also possible for all the wrong decisions to be made in that process because it's an option. Each one is a question. If the consultation went the other way, it could easily lead to a standard which we couldn't support at the Passive House Trust as being Scottish Passive House equivalent, which is why we are encouraging everybody in the Passive House community and beyond to respond in a clear, positive and supportive way to this consultation, because this is like a really, really critical moment. And at the heart of our concerns are those things around modeling tools and targets. I have this one slide. Do I have time to do this? I can see you, Elrond, if you want to nod. Yeah. Okay. So this is actually a slide which Jonathan Hines from Archetype put together when I was presenting with him the other day on this. And I thought this was a really, really good way to talk about why modeling tools and targets matters and why the way we do it at the moment just doesn't work. So this is using cars as the analogy. So if you have an absolute target, like a path, which is what Passive House has, absolute targets, for example, 60 miles to the gallon, people then designed cars to be optimized to that metric. So you get the design is optimized so that the car can achieve the miles per gallon that you want. The user then knows if the car is achieving the miles per gallon that it said. The government can then set a higher target over time in the future and measure actual progress over time. All those things just seem very, very sensible. But then when you compare it to how building standards actually work, which is this notional, we'll do 20% improvement on what that exact building that you've built now would have looked like in 1990, and we'll do this strange improvement, you end up with these crazy inefficient forms. And you can create a really inefficient design, and it can easily achieve compliance with that notional reduction because you start with the inefficiency built in and you only have to do the improvement on that. And it can result in a car, or in our case, a building, that's using way more fuel than it should ever use to enclose that volume, and which the user then has no benchmark in which to compare because their meter reading doesn't tell them what improvement it was over what the meter reading would have been in 1990. And the government then has no way to measure progress over time. So the current system it does not work well to incentivize good design. We've got a system which would with absolute targets. So we are really keen that we move from notional to absolute targets. And this is a link to the consultation if you want to have a look. I think this link takes you to our Passive House Trust website page on the consultation. You can see the little video of me going through it. And then Jono presents that slide probably much better than I do. And then we go through all the questions in the consultation that we think are really critical. So yeah, a good one for you to look at. If you want to respond, we would certainly really appreciate it because this is certainly our call to action. And maybe, so this is just like Passive House has all these other benefits, which I know you guys already know, so I won't dwell on that. This is why we do it. People now have amazing sleeps at night. Didn't beforehand because the air quality in the houses is so good. Like mental health, physical health, well-being, significantly better in Passive House buildings and buildings which are healthy. We get a more productive population. We get resilience through having warmer buildings, and we have those healthy homes. The cost to the NHS in the National Health Service in Scotland is huge from our poor performing buildings. So if we had these, that would be another saving for us. Lots of resources we've got that we point people to around net zero and how Passive House fits in from an operational, embodied or retrofit side. Lots of events going on. And then this is the very final slide. So this is just to say that the Scottish construction industry is rising to the challenge already of the Passive House standard through the schools programme. We've got many projects completed or underway in the housing sector as well, which really demonstrates Scotland's ability to embrace the standard. And in doing so, of course, Scotland would be joining other nations and regions around the world in that kind of Passive House vanguard. For inspiration, we've got Vancouver's example. I recently read that Passive House policies had meant that construction was the only category on track to meet the city's 2030 climate goals. And then just this week in our region, the largest housing developer in Ireland just announced that all of their new developments are going to meet the Passive House standard going forward. So if a housing developer says that they're going to do it, I think we are at a pivotal moment of change in I was going to say in the UK, but that's in Ireland. So maybe just worldwide, we're all ready for a change. And on that, I'll pause for questions. Sorry, I'm a bit over time.
Thanks, Sarah. That was brilliant. And thanks for going through that consultation process at the end there, because I'd had a kind of quick glance when that came out and I was like, oh, this is kind of like throwing a few potential spanners in the works.
Yeah.
Yep, Karen.
I was going to say the consultation, it's an 80-page read if you wanted to read the whole thing. And the information is all there. It's just that thing around every single thing we need to make meaningful change to our regulations and lay the foundation for a Scottish Passive House equivalent to be set when we get to the metric stage is in that consultation. But the recommendations that are made for some of the questions are like the opposite. So it's like we need to say no to the ones which are not supportive, and we need to say yes to the ones that are. So there is work to be done. And we're at this critical point, because if we get all the right responses to that consultation, we would be in a really good position. And alternatively, we might end up with business as usual and not have any meaningful change. So
yeah. We're going to try and finish this session up a little bit early, so around 10 o'clock. So does anybody have any questions for Sarah? Rachel?
So is there orchestrated pushback resistance from particular sectors that's putting at risk the right choices being made at this point? I'm asking this from New Zealand context where there's massive resistance to even incremental improvements in our building code.
Did you catch that, Sarah?
I did catch the question. Yeah. So I think the answer is probably yes. There has been a lot of pushback, but I think there's the same pushback comes back from any profit-making sector when a change comes in, especially when it's an improvement to regulations like this. So I think, in general, the developers have a model that works and they would like to keep doing that model. But they all, like when we meet them in the working groups, everybody appreciates the direction of travel. And for them, I think the biggest thing has been saying, okay, we're not saying this is going to happen December 2024. We're saying it's going to happen at a point in the future, and there's going to be a way to get there. So it's kind of bringing everyone with us. What we've said over and over again to Scottish Government and the building standards team is what we don't want is just like a watered down version now that still uses notional buildings and all those things that's not going to make any meaningful change. We don't want incremental improvements, because incremental improvements, it doesn't matter if you put another 100 mil of insulation in. If you've got a 60% performance gap, you'd be much better not to put any extra insulation in and get rid of the 60% performance gap. So we're like, it's that fundamental change to the way that we're delivering buildings. And I really feel like that part the Scottish Government has really accepted. And a lot of the consultation is talking about construction quality and compliance. And those parts of the consultation we're really supportive of. And so basically what we're trying to say at the moment is let's just change the metrics, the tools, and we'll deal with target setting at the later stage. So we could potentially set the targets at a slightly lower level and then build up. But by having those absolute metrics, we'll be able to monitor performance. So we'll actually know what we're meeting. So we could use, we can look at what they're delivering at the moment and step up. So it's like, I think there's ways to have the conversation, which is not just about we need everybody to change to Passive House right now. It's about setting that trajectory, which I think everybody knows that we need to go on.
Thanks, that was great. I think we're going to finish it there. Sorry, Joe. We need to move on to the next things. Thanks, Sarah. And I think that's Finns here in New Zealand has also put similar criticisms to the building code in New Zealand in the sense that we don't necessarily mind about what R values or U values are specified for elements. We really want a system that produces outcomes that are predictable and you actually know what you're getting and you can close that performance gap and then you can worry about improving the overall performance.
Exactly. I mean, I think like just on a tiny note there, on the schools program, one of the amazing things, I meet with a group of all the schools across Scotland. They all come together every 6 weeks, the clients of these schools, so the local authorities, and discuss the Passivhaus projects they're working on. And one of them was just saying what's really amazing is that the U values of the school didn't have to be any better than the last school they delivered, but the energy performance is just like off the scales better. And they're like, the only thing that has changed is basically quality in the modeling, quality in like the way that the building is being designed, and then quality on site. And it's like, that's kind of amazing. We didn't need better U values. We just needed better quality, better control, and better delivery on site.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. If everyone wants to put their hands together again for Sarah joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks,
Have a good
Sarah.
rest of the conference.